definitely see a regulatory trend, a global regulatory trend to combat money laundering and terrorist financing.
Hello, and welcome to the Bankers Masterclass series in association with Deutsche Bank, looking at the effect the revised EU funds transfer regulation, which comes into force in June, will have on financial institutions. I'm Joy Macknight, Deputy Editor of The Banker, and I'm joined by Stefan Fruschki, Head of Regulatory Management, Institutional Cash Management at Deutsche Bank. The issue of preventing money laundering and terrorist financing has become a major focus for nation states across the world, rising in importance over the past few years. In Chapter 1 of this four-part series, we explore the evolving regulatory landscape and the importance of the EU Funds Transfer Regulation 2015. Thanks so much for joining us today,
Pleasure
Stefan.
to be here.
So can you give us a little bit of background on the EU Funds Transfer Regulation and how it sort of fits into the global regulatory environment?
Well, we definitely see a regulatory trend, a global regulatory trend to combat money laundering and terrorist financing. So, and as these kind of activities are often carried out in an international context, there is clear an awareness that you cannot, on an isolated national basis alone, fight these kind of activities. So to better align national efforts, for example, the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF, which is an intergovernmental body, was established actually already some while ago in 1989. And its mandate is to set standards and to promote the implementation of regulation and operational measures to combat money laundering and terrorist financing. And actually these kind of standards had a huge impact when it came to the adoption of the FTR 2015.
Okay, and you talked about the FATF, and also there's the fourth anti-money laundering directive going on to the fifth. Can you tell me how FTR is actually going to fit into those two frameworks?
So the FTA in beginning of 2012 issued revised recommendations, and the European legislator in May 2015 adopted both the fourth AMLD as well as the Funds Transfer Regulation 2015. And the European legislator thereby took into account these revised FATF recommendations. So if you look at the FTR 2015, it actually transposes, one has to say, to a certain extent, the recommendation 16 on wire transfers.
Okay, but what is sort of the difference between them, the FATF recommendation 16 and the FTR?
I think what is important to note in this context is these recommendations that are issued by FATF, they are non-binding. So national legislators do take these non-binding recommendations into account. However, often these recommendations are not fully, or sometimes even in deviation, implemented. So what you quite often hear in this context is this FATF compliance, which as a term is okay if you do not take it literally, because, as I said, you must always look at the local laws and regulations that may differ to FATF and must achieve compliance with the local laws. So from that perspective, if you understand FATF compliance as a reference to those kind of laws that were enacted in this context, that is perfectly fine. So when we come to the differences between FATF 16 and FTR 2015, a good example would be the switch into payment systems with technical limitations. So as an example, the FATF 16 allows intermediary payment service providers to switch payment transactions into payment schemes that have technical limitations, even though, as a result of that technical limitation, certain information gets lost or cannot be transmitted. Now that is actually in line with their previous recommendation, and that is also in line with the current applicable laws and regulations here in Europe. However, the FTR itself, the FTR 2015, does not contain such exemption anymore. And that may have actually a huge impact now on the question how and when an intermediary bank may switch payment transactions into the local European clearing systems.
Okay. And obviously, FTR 2015 updates and repeals FTR 2006. Do you see this really as a revolutionary change or an evolution in the regulatory environment?
Well, FTR is an evolution, but not a revolution. I mean, FTR, as you just said, is repealing its preceding regulation, the 2006 regulation, so it's building on that. It's not putting in place new principles as such. It's just extending those principles and some additional requirements. So, for an example, very prominent, it now extends certain requirements on the intermediary bankings sphere, and of course, it requires, legally requires you to send certain information on the payee in certain scenarios. But what I would not do in this context is, because there are these obvious changes, that could lead to the false impression that it is more of a low issue or it is not an important issue, that you could be quite mistaken, because when you go into the details, there's really more than meets the eye.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Stefan. In Chapter 2 of this 4-part series, we're going to be looking in greater detail at the FTR requirements and also what financial institutions have to do in order to comply.